When war erupted in 1914, the United States attempted to remain neutral and was a proponent for the rights of neutral states. Isolationist foreign policy was encouraged by Congress's apprehensions of giving other countries a political door into U.S. policies and the cultural melting pot of the United States population. President Woodrow Wilson had said America was too proud to fight, a sentiment that mirrored his own distaste for war. High-minded, idealistic, and academic, he had formed the belief that plain dealing between nations in open diplomacy was the secret to averting and evading conflict. During 1916, he had, through his emissary, Colonel Edward House, made a determined but unsuccessful effort to bring the combatants to the negotiation on terms he regarded as fair to all. As late as the spring of 1917, he had no intention of joining the war, nor was there enthusiasm for entry among his fellow citizens. In an attempt by both the Allied and the Central Powers to involve the Americans, the U.S. was heavily saturated with propaganda. Much of the material had a pro-British slant, which was aided by the connection to Britain as a cultural brother and the United States' concern with affairs in Western Europe. While propaganda sympathetic to Germany did also exist, it did not carry much weight with the American public. Germany was seen by most Americans as a dangerous monarchy with autocratic militaristic thinking, including a hidden agenda to undermine democracy and U.S. power. There were allegations of industrial sabotage, poisoning water supplies, kidnapping individuals, and engaging in espionage within American labor unions by Germans to keep the United States busy on the home front. These rumors, along with extensive submarine warfare, added to the distrust of the Germans. Prior to 1915, German subs had a policy of warning and allowing time to evacuate ships carrying passengers before they sank them. However, in 1915, the Lusitania was sunk without a warning, killing over 120 Americans. 1 year later, the Sussex was sunk by German U-boats, and American citizens were outraged at these direct violations of their neutral rights at sea. At this point, a small percentage of Americans, including presidential hopeful Teddy Roosevelt, demanded immediate warfare. In 1916, President Wilson took a stronger stance toward foreign affairs by increasing the size of the military and issuing a warning to the Germans. Unless the imperial government should now immediately declare and effect an abandonment of its present methods of submarine warfare against passenger and freight-carrying vessels, the government of the United States can have no choice but to sever diplomatic relations with the German Empire altogether. The Germans responded by temporarily ceasing submarine warfare until 1917, when German Ambassador Bernstorff announced the continuation of submarine warfare and ended diplomatic relations with the United States.
Well, Wilson, when the Germans sank the Lusitania, wasn't it, that they sank, and so many people died, and Americans, Wilson said, "Stop it, don't hit any of our ships or anything." Well, the Germans did that for a while, but in the fall of 1916, the Germans decided that the Americans aren't going to be able to do anything anyway.
However, military strategists predicted certain defeat for the Germans if America entered the war at this point. In an effort to eliminate the threat of American involvement in Europe, Foreign Minister Alfred Zimmerman attempted to provoke Mexico and Japan into attacking the United States with the promise of German assistance after the European front was conquered. A message containing Zimmerman's intent was decoded by the British and sent to the U.S., further swaying Americans to action. The campaign in the seas around the British Isles, on the west coast of France, and in the Mediterranean began on February 1st. The political effect in the United States was felt immediately, and the severity of the American reaction vastly exceeded German expectations. On March 15th, German submarines made direct attacks on American merchant ships, sinking 3. This was a direct challenge to the dignity of the United States as a sovereign power, one which Wilson reluctantly decided he could not ignore. Due primarily to submarine warfare and the Zimmerman Note, President Wilson asked Congress for permission to go to war. And on April 6, 1917, Congress officially declared it. President Wilson, along with many Americans, justified their involvement as an act of high principle and idealism, and as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy.
And then the Zimmerman Note was the Germans were trying to get the Mexicans to go to war against us and all of that. And then finally Wilson asked for the declaration of war. But when he asked for the things, regular Army units were down to, say, a company is supposed to be 200 men. They're down to maybe 50 or 75 in a company. And then all of a sudden, they got a lot of enlistees first. Then they came up with the draft, and they started pouring them in. But most of those people really didn't get that much training. I mean, they shipped the 1st Division over almost immediately. And they trained with the French, and the first ones committed to battle were in November.
In 1917, Europe, all of Europe, was on the verge of bankruptcy. Yet the Great War went on. It had swept like a black storm over Europe, consuming the flower of an entire generation and leaving in its wake unimaginable carnage. The terrible cost of the war in Russia had already toppled its government. The new Bolshevik government was pleading with Germany for peace negotiations. In June 1918, exhausted by nearly 4 years of war and on the verge of defeat, the Allied forces on the Western Front of the Great War had but one glimmer of hope. The long-awaited news that the Yanks are coming. Imperial Germany, in a last all-or-nothing attempt to win the 4-year-old struggle before the American troops arrived, had thrown everything it had at the British and French lines. German infantry and artillery units were now massed at the Marne River, less than 60 miles from Paris. Their great spring offensive stood on the edge of a knife. If they could just push those 60 more miles before the Yanks arrived in full force, they could finally end and win the war.
The Germans, all we have to do is maintain. Let's wear the Allies down. Knowing they can't win the war, it's now make it so costly that the Allies will come to the Germans and say, let's discuss peace terms. Let's try to end this thing. Of course, that all changed when the Americans joined.
Broken and war-weary, the Allies had one hope: fresh troops in America. They will not even come, Admiral Chappell, the Secretary of State for the Navy, had assured the German Parliament on January 31st, 1917, because our submarines will sink them. Thus, America, from a military point of view, means nothing, and again, nothing, and for a third time, nothing. He was mistaken.
I've seen the reports of foreign American attachés with the Brits and the Germans and Austrians and all that. And it was interesting because most of the countries, the attaché would write back, they're not interested in the Army. It's so small, it's insignificant. They don't think it's a problem.
When the United States had finally been jolted from its neutrality by constant attacks on its merchant ships and had declared war on Germany in April 1917, no one doubted that American military might would turn the tide of the war and send the Germans home if they arrived in time. The problem with this great tide of enthusiasm, though, was that it was based on an utterly mistaken assumption. There was one area that America's entry into the war affected immediately. That was at sea. The mobilization of the United States Navy, with the second largest fleet of modern battleships in the world after Britain's, immediately altered the balance of naval power in the Allies' favor. The specter of America's gathering millions lent even greater urgency to Germany's attempt to starve out its European enemies by U-boat action. In August 1914, at the start of World War I, Germany had 29 U-boats in service. In the first 10 weeks, 5 British cruisers had been lost to them. In September, U-9 sank the obsolete British warships Aboukir, Cressy, and Hogue in a matter of an hour. For the first few months of the war, U-boat anti-commerce actions observed the current prize rules, which govern the treatment of enemy civilian ships and their occupants. On October 20th, 1914, the U-boat U-17 sank the first merchant ship, the SS Glitra, off Norway. Surface commerce raiders were proving to be ineffective, and on February 4th, 1915, the Kaiser assented to the declaration of a war zone in the waters around the British Isles. This was cited as retaliation for British minefields and shipping blockades. Under the instructions given to U-boat captains, they could sink merchant ships, potentially neutral ones, without warning. A statement by the U.S. government holding Germany strictly accountable for any loss of American lives made no material difference. On May 7, 1915, U-20 sank the liner RMS Lusitania with a single torpedo hit. The sinking claimed 1,198 lives, 128 of them American civilians, including noted theatrical producer Charles Frohman and Alfred Vanderbilt, a member of the prestigious Vanderbilt family. The sinking deeply shocked the Allies and their sympathizers because an unarmed civilian merchant vessel was attacked without any warning. According to the ship's manifest, Lusitania was carrying military cargo. After further investigations, it has been confirmed that the Lusitania was in fact carrying bullets and ammunition for the Allies to use against the Germans. It was not until the sinking of the ferry Sussex that there was a widespread reaction in the U.S. The initial U.S. response was to threaten to sever diplomatic relations, which persuaded the Germans to reimpose restrictions on U-boat activity. The U.S. reiterated its objections to German submarine warfare whenever U.S. civilians died as a result of German attacks, which prompted the Germans to fully reapply prize rules. This, however, removed the effectiveness of the U-boat fleet, and the Germans consequently sought a decisive surface action, a strategy which culminated in the Battle of Jutland. Although the Germans claimed victory at Jutland, the British Grand Fleet remained in control at sea. It was necessary to return to effective anti-commerce warfare by U-boats. Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, Commander-in-Chief of the High Seas Fleet, pressed for all-out U-boat war, convinced that a high rate of shipping losses would force Britain to seek an early peace before the United States could react effectively. The renewed German campaign was effective, sinking 1.4 million tons of shipping between October 1916 and January 1917. Despite this, the political situation demanded even greater pressure, and on January 31, 1917, Germany announced that its U-boats would engage in unrestricted submarine warfare beginning February 1st. On March 17th, German submarines sank 3 American merchant vessels, and the U.S. declared war in April 1917. The British Admiralty could see no means to avert disaster. Hunting U-boats was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Trapping U-boats with apparently harmless decoys not worth a torpedo, the Q-ships, disguised as small merchantmen but heavily armed, worked on odd occasions until the German captains got canny. Meanwhile, the hemorrhage continued, apparently unquenchably. U-boat losses were negligible. There was a solution, convoy, but the Admiralty resisted it. Sailing ships in groups, even under escort, seemed merely to offer a large group of targets. The Admiralty was wrong. Admiral William Sims, in command of U.S. Navy forces in Europe, felt that the British were facing imminent disaster at the hands of the U-boats and begged for anti-submarine resources. The U.S. ambassador to Britain, Walter Hines Page, reported the same fears back to Washington. Sinkings rose again in May, and the Admiralty predicted the country would not be able to hold out past November 1917. The U.S. Navy sent 6 destroyers to Queenstown, Ireland, in early May, with many more to follow. America's production capabilities were much greater than Britain's, and American shipyards could turn out a destroyer in 6 weeks that British yards took a year and a half to build. Losses could now be made good. The simple statistics encouraged the British Admiralty to begin merchant convoys. Nobody was sure if convoys were Britain's salvation or ruin. Although the Admiralty dragged their feet, by autumn the convoy system had become very well organized, and losses for ships in convoy fell drastically, with 2% losses for ships in convoy compared to 10% losses for ships traveling on their own. The convoy loss rate dropped to 1% in October. However, convoy was not mandatory, and monthly loss rates did not fall below their 1916 levels until August 1918. The British had also perfected the first weapon that could be used to attack a U-boat underwater, the depth charge. The concept was first proposed by Admiral Sir Charles Madden, an Admiralty staff officer who heard a report of a U-boat escaping a British warship by diving, and suggested to Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, wouldn't it have been fine if they had had a mine that, when dropped overboard, exploded when it reached the depth at which the submarine was lying? Depth charges were first used in action on July 1916, when the patrol craft HMS Salmon attacked UC-7, though UC-7 escaped. On December 6, 1917, depth charges scored their first U-boat kill, when the destroyer HMS Llewellyn sank the UC-19 in the Dover Straits. The next week, HMS Landrell sank UB-29 in the English Channel. The Americans quickly adopted the ashcan, as they called it, and the weapon accounted for several dozen U-boats by the end of the war. Even when the blows from the depth charges did no real damage to the submarine, the barrage was terrifying and demoralizing to the U-boat crews. The Germans had gambled they could choke Britain before America could exert its influence on the war, or at least prevent American supplies and reinforcements from crossing the Atlantic. They failed. 2 million American soldiers were sent to Europe, and the U-boats only managed to sink one troop transport. In the end, the German strategy failed to destroy sufficient Allied shipping, largely due to the introduction of escorted convoys, before U.S. manpower and materiel could be brought to bear in France. In April 1916, the United States was as poorly prepared to go to war as any nation in history. In truth, America had no military might. It ranked in size 17th in the world. It had no experience of large-scale operations since Appomattox 52 years earlier, and it possessed no modern equipment heavier than its medium machine guns. Yet by June 1917, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force had arrived in France. The U.S. Army had fewer than 135,000 troops. The U.S. Marine Corps had only a few thousand men.
You could also say that the Marines went into it. There were individuals, officers and senior NCOs who knew what battle was, who knew what was going to happen, but the grand majority hadn't experienced what is the combat of the Western Front or combat of that type yet. And really they were the young hunting dog out for the first time. So when they ran forward, it was, we're going. We have the pride of our nation and the pride of the Marine Corps to keep going, mixed in with an exuberance that they didn't know how bad it was going to be.
These troops were not organized or trained for combat, and they lacked even the most basic supplies. When war was declared, the Army struggled to find enough guns for its recruits even to train with. Once the United States declared war on Germany, a great wave of patriotism drove men by the thousands into the Army, Navy, and Marine recruiting offices.
That's an interesting point. I think they probably were, because the Germans didn't have a very, the rape of Belgium and things like that. And of course they were getting a lot from the Brits about what was going on, not that they liked the Brits that much. And the French, of course, they seemed to think the French were all heroes and that, but it didn't, I don't think, yes, basically I think they were enthusiastic when it started. But then as time went on, they started drafting a lot, and of course there were all sorts of problems.
The drill instructors, whose job it was to ready their new recruits for war, were stern taskmasters. In the summer of 1917, the War Department managed to put together enough men and material to send a division to war in France as the American Expeditionary Force under the command of Major General John J. Pershing.
Not very many units actually were fully trained, because they would form these divisions and then they'd get ready to ship one overseas and they would pull people out of the other one. So very few of them had had much training at all. And then toward the end, there were guys literally who'd been drafted and they'd never fired a rifle or anything. I ran across one, I think it was in the 77th Division. They had these guys coming in to join it, and a sergeant was charging one 5 francs to show him how to load his rifle. He'd been in the Army about 4 weeks or something, so it was a rush thing. And of course, one reason, a lot of these guys are going to get killed because they didn't know what in the world was going on.
When the doughboys of the Army and Marines arrived in France, they would combine into fighting divisions. The brash young Yanks chafed at the bit to prove themselves. Their chance would come soon enough. Through the efforts of the Central Committee of Negro College Men, President Wilson established a special training camp to train black officers for proposed segregated black regiments. The 369th Regiment was formed from the National Guard's 15th Regiment in New York. The 15th Regiment was formed after Charles S. Whitman was elected governor of New York. He enforced the legislation that was passed due to the efforts of the 10th Cavalry in Mexico, which had passed as a law but never actually manifested until June 2nd, 1913.
There were two combat divisions in the American Expeditionary Force. There was the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. The 93rd was made up of 3 National Guard units and 1 unit of black draftees from the South. And the Harlem Hellfighters were the 15th New York National Guard, and it became the 369th U.S. Infantry. The 8th Illinois National Guard became the 370th U.S. Infantry. Then you had the 371st, which were the black draftees from South Carolina, I believe. And then you had the 372nd, which was made up of National Guard units from Ohio, Washington, D.C., Delaware, and a few other places.
Racism was often an obstacle to the black soldier, but one unit was handpicked to go to France in 1918 because of their color.
And a year prior to that, on the 25th of March 1917, the 1st D.C. Battalion had been the very first National Guardsmen mustered in for federal service. They were handpicked by the Secretary of War specifically because of their race, as basically proof of their national origin as Americans and their loyalty to the flag, something that they couldn't guarantee in the white regiments because they had so many foreigners in their ranks. And of course, back in those days, it wasn't like now. You emigrated, you went back and forth, and really nobody cut ties with the old country. So they couldn't trust that Private Schultz in the Umpty-Umph Infantry Regiment wasn't going to let his cousin Heinrich just sort of slip in the back door of the Capitol and leave a bomb under the steps. Hence the choice of colored troops.
Even when trying to show bravery and courage for their country, they were discriminated against. African American soldiers, although being drafted in greater proportions, were thought to be less battle-worthy than their white counterparts due to racism present in the military. The unit was relegated to labor service duties instead of combat training. The U.S. Army decided on April 8, 1918, to assign the unit to the French Army for the duration of the U.S. participation in the war.
Yeah, they were attached to, the 93rd Division was attached to the French Army. In fact, they never really fought as a division. Each regiment served with a different French division. The 372nd and 371st served with the 157th French Infantry Division.
The men were issued French helmets and brown leather belts and pouches, although they continued to wear their U.S. uniforms.
They kept their American uniforms. They turned in all their American equipment and were issued French rifles, French ammunition belts, packs, helmets, etc., and gas masks. Okay. But they kept their American uniforms. And actually by September 1918, they started wearing the American helmet by then, before the big push.
Unlike the British, the French held good experiences and memories with black soldiers, which made for a more positive environment when working together. The 369th Infantry Regiment was relieved May 8, 1918, from assignment to the 185th Infantry Brigade, and went into the trenches as part of the French 16th Division. It served continuously to July 3rd.
Part of the reason they were attached to the French Army was the French needed troops, and purging some of the white officers in the AEF didn't want black combat troops. So to satisfy, most of those guys were from the South. In order to satisfy the white officers in the American Expeditionary Force and to make the French officers happy, or French Army happy, he gave the French the 93rd Division. On
one tour, they were out for over 6 months, which was the longest deployment of any unit in World War I. At the end of the war, the 369th returned to New York City and in February 1919 paraded through the city. Thousands lined the streets to see them. The parade began on Fifth Avenue at 61st Street, proceeded uptown past ranks of white bystanders, turned west and marched into Harlem, where black New Yorkers packed the sidewalks to see them. The parade became a marker of African American service to the nation, a frequent point of reference for those campaigning for civil rights in the 1920s and 1930s. At an Allied conference in Rome in January 1917, Luigi Cadorna, Italy's chief of staff, called for 8 British and French divisions and 300 heavy guns to capture Trieste and knock Austria out of the war. He was promised artillery, but only on loan for 2 to 3 months. The situation in Macedonia, where pressure on Saloniki was increasing, made equally urgent demands on the Allies and the Russian Revolution. Beginning in March, it enabled the Austrians to transfer formations from the east to augment their forces on the Isonzo and Trentino fronts. Undeterred, Cadorna ordered 2 more attacks, the 10th and 11th on Isonzo. At the end of August, the Italians seemed on the point of final victory. Austrian morale was crumbling as non-Germanic regiments lost their stomach for the war. With the Austro-Hungarian front around Gorizia in danger of collapse, the German Third Supreme Command under Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff sent massive reinforcements for the Austrian Army commander Count Francis Conrad von Hötzendorf's army. These included elite units trained in new tactics of assault. In one such unit served an officer with a future. Major Erwin Rommel commanded a company in a Württemberg mountain battalion that was to play a key role in the forthcoming 12th Battle of the Isonzo. Luigi Cadorna, Italy's chief of staff, had long feared a German intervention at the Isonzo. The Italians began to receive reports from deserters and via aerial reconnaissance of German activity on the front. Cadorna therefore called off his own attacks on the Isonzo in mid-September, preferring instead to adopt a defensive posture. There is little doubt that Cadorna was unaware of the actual strength of the Austro-Hungarian German forces massing against him. The Austro-Hungarian High Command was initially in favor of repeating their 1916 Trentino offensive against the Italians. Overruled, however, by the Germans, a 25-mile line was carefully selected in front of Caporetto, north of Gorizia, and along the Isonzo as the preferred point of attack. The Third Supreme Command's intention in launching the Caporetto offensive was chiefly to provide the Austro-Hungarian army with the opportunity for recuperation. Hindenburg and Ludendorff assuredly did not anticipate the spectacular success of the actual operation. 9 Austrian divisions were supplemented by 6 German divisions and placed under Otto von Billow's command as the 14th Army in October 1917. Although the Italians retained overall numerical supremacy along the Isonzo front, they were notably weaker at the points selected by the German army for the combined offensive. The local Italian commander at Caporetto, Capello, was ordered to prepare a defensive line. He chose instead to adopt an aggressive posture, massing his troops for an attack upon the southern flank of von Billow's army to the east of Gorizia. Launched at 2 a.m. on October 24, 1917, from a salient at Tolmino, and much aided by prevalent misty conditions, the Austro-Hungarian German attack took the Italians by complete surprise. Initiated with a heavy artillery barrage of high explosives, gas, and smoke, the combined force broke through the Italian Second Army's lines almost immediately. They progressed a remarkable 25 miles by the close of the day. Adopting infiltration tactics and exploiting breaches in the Italian line, with the use of grenades and flamethrowers. Bilo's secondary attacks on either side of the main offensive were, however, more competently staved off by the Italians. Similarly, the Austro-Hungarian Fifth Army under Borevik made little progress at the southern coast. Nevertheless, Bilo's sweeping success in the center endangered the bulk of the Italian forces at the river Tagliamento. Once his lines were rapidly broken on that first morning, Capello recommended a withdrawal to the Tagliamento. He was overruled by Cadorna, who harbored hopes of repairing the damage for almost a week. On October 30th, the majority of Italian forces were instructed to cross the river, a process that took some 4 days. Meanwhile, a German division had established a bridgehead further north at the Tagliamento on November 2nd. Ironically, the success of the combined Austro-Hungarian-German forces in moving forward so rapidly began to work against them, with supply lines at full stretch and starting to fail. Cadorna took advantage of the Austro-Hungarian-German inability to launch a fresh offensive by ordering a withdrawal to the River Piave, a mere 30 miles north of Venice, a process that lasted until approximately November 10th. The scale of the Italian setback was huge. Some 300,000 casualties had been incurred, with virtually all artillery lost, producing a sizable shockwave among the Allied governments. At home, Cadorna was dismissed and replaced by Armando Diaz, a new prime minister. Vittorio Orlando similarly took office, replacing Boselli. He promptly received assurances of increased military support from Allied governments. Until Caporetto, the Italians had been left to fight the Austro-Hungarian army alone on the Italian front. With the advent of German support and the disaster at Caporetto, however, this policy was revoked, with substantial Allied aid promised thenceforth. 6 French Army divisions were supplemented by 5 British divisions, both boosted by large air contingents. Italian public opinion, shocked by the events at Caporetto, rallied behind Orlando's government, with popular pacifist sentiment effectively silenced. The Austro-Hungarians attempted to follow up the success at Caporetto with an attack at the Trentino on November 12th, but finding themselves short of reserves, the attack petered out 5 days later, although sporadic fighting continued into December. Throughout the spring and summer of 1918, as matters hung in the balance in France, the Italian front was quiet. Despite the resounding defeat of the Austro-Hungarians at the Battle of the Piave River in June 1918, the cautious Italian Chief of Staff, Armando Diaz, hesitated to press home his advantage over the Austro-Hungarians, preferring to confine the army to local operation. This was despite appeals from both Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, and Lord Cavan, commander of British forces in Italy. Diaz, determined to give his army time to recover, declined to attack until ordered to do so by Premier Orlando in October. Orlando believed an attack was now essential in order to gain bargaining power at the conference table. The advancing successes of Italy's allies on the Western Front, which effectively ruled out German assistance to their Austro-Hungarian allies on the Italian front, brought about a change of heart. The offensive launched by Diaz was an assault on the Piave intended to advance upon Vittorio Veneto. Diaz reasoned that this would cause a separation of Austro-Hungarian forces on the Adriatic plains from those in the mountains, at which point he would simply roll up the isolated Austro-Hungarian mountain force. Separately, to the west at Mount Grappa, the Italian Fourth Army would penetrate the Austro-Hungarian lines held by Archduke Joseph and Borevik von Bonja. Facing the Austro-Hungarians across the river were 4 Italian armies, the 3rd, 8th, 10th, and 12th. The combined Italian force totaled a sizable 57 divisions, of which 3 were British and 2 French, along with a single U.S. regiment. Ranged against them were 52 nominal Austro-Hungarian divisions. In terms of artillery, the Italians also held the advantage, with 7,700 guns to 6,030. Crucially, Italian morale was notably higher than the thoroughly demoralized Austro-Hungarian force. The attack opened on October 23, 1918, with an Italian advance in the mountains. However, the extent of Austro-Hungarian resistance surprised Diaz and succeeded in preventing any significant Italian gains, although the Austro-Hungarians were obliged to bring up reserves from the lower Piave. Such reserves could be ill-afforded, given that the main Italian advance began the same day in the lower Piave. Lord Caven's 10th Army succeeded in capturing Papadopoli Island 2 days later on October 25th. On October 27th, his force was again to the fore, succeeding in spite of a river flood in establishing a bridgehead across the river, meeting with relatively light Austro-Hungarian resistance. Some 24 miles further north, 12th Army, led by General Graziani, also crossed the river and likewise established a bridgehead. The 8th Army followed to Graziani's right. Shortly afterwards, Caven dispatched 2 detachments to clear the river of remaining Austro-Hungarian resistance, after which the bridgeheads were joined. With Caven's main force pushing ahead on October 27th, the Austro-Hungarian 5th Army was forced back. 3 days later, the Italian 3rd and 10th Armies succeeded in reaching the river Livenza, and 8th Army took the primary target of Vittorio Veneto, thereby splitting the Austro-Hungarian armies. With the Allies succeeding in advancing 24 miles along a 56-mile front, a truce was finally agreed upon on November 2nd, with the capture of Tagliamento. An armistice came into effect the following day, signed at Padua. Hostilities were formally concluded on November 4th, 1918. A resounding success for the Allies, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto finished the Austro-Hungarian army as a fighting force. The Italians lost some 38,000 casualties, a figure dwarfed by the 300,000 prisoners suffered by the Austro-Hungarians. Simultaneous political turmoil completed the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the spring of 1917, General Sorel's Armée d'Orient had been reinforced to the point that he had 22 divisions, 6 French, 6 Serbian, 7 British, 1 Italian, 1 National Defense Greek, and 2 Russian brigades. Further, 2 Greek divisions were being formed. An offensive was planned for late April, but the initial attack failed with major losses, and the offensive was called off on May 21st. Subsequently, the Allies, wishing to exert more pressure on Athens, occupied Thessaly, which had been evacuated by the Royalist Greek army, and the Isthmus of Corinth, practically severing the country in two. Further diplomatic pressure resulted in the exile of the Greek king on June 14th and the reunification of the country under Prime Minister Venizelos, supported by Allied bayonets. The new government immediately declared war on the Central Powers and started to create a new army. Despite this favorable outcome, the new French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, recalled General Sorel in November and put a much more diplomatic French general, Adolphe Guillemot, in his place. In May 1918, General Guillemot's Greek troops attacked and captured the strong Bulgarian position of Skro-de-Legin, marking the first major Greek action on the Allied side in the war. However, with the German offensive threatening France, Guillemot was recalled to Paris and replaced by General Franchet d'Espèrey. Although d'Espèrey urged an attack on the Bulgarian army, the French government refused to allow an offensive unless all the countries agreed. General Guillemot, no longer needed in France, traveled from London to Rome, trying to win approval for an attack. Finally, in September, agreement was reached, and d'Espèrey was allowed to launch his grand offensive. The Allied forces were now very large. Not only did they have the Greek army fully on their side, 9 divisions strong, they also had some 6,000 men from the Czech Legion, who had been evacuated from Russia and sailed around the world, ready to fight the hated Austro-Hungarians. The Bulgarians had also increased the size of their army during 1917, and in total manpower, the two sides were roughly equal, 291 Allied battalions versus 300 Bulgarian battalions, plus 10 German battalions. But in morale, the two sides were completely different. The Allies were certain of their impending victory, while the Bulgarians could see the war was lost. The Ottoman Empire was near collapse. The Austro-Hungarian government was in chaos, and the mighty German army was beaten on the all-important Western Front. The Bulgarians were not willing to fight and die for a lost cause. The Battle of Dobro Pole started with the artillery bombardment of enemy positions on September 14th. The following day, the French and Serbians attacked and captured their objective. On September 18th, the Greeks and the British attacked as well, but were stopped with heavy losses by the Bulgarians in the Battle of Doran. However, the Franco-Serbian army continued advancing vigorously. The next day, some Bulgarian units started surrendering positions without a fight. Bulgarian command ordered a retreat. On September 30th, the Bulgarians were granted the Armistice of Solon by General d'Espèrey, ending their war. Tsar Ferdinand I of Bulgaria abdicated and went into exile 4 days later. At this point, the British army headed east toward the European side of the Ottoman Empire, while the French and Serbian forces continued north. The British army neared Constantinople, and with no serious Ottoman forces to stop it, the Ottoman government asked for an armistice on October 26th. With desperate Frankie, as the British called d'Espèrey, pushing ever forward, the Franco-Serbian army recaptured Serbia and overran several weak German divisions that tried to block its advance near Niš. On November 10th, d'Espèrey's army crossed the Danube River and was poised to enter the heartland of Hungary when the war finally came to an end.
Oh, is it says the Colonel gets better grub than you? Any complaints this morning? Do we complain? Not we. What's the matter with lumps of onion floating around your tea? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, be a soldier, eh?
Oh, it's a shame to take the pain.
As soon as the valley has gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the start that brings our breakfast up to bed. Rats. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what months and eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Oh, pause, right turn, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, it's a lovely war.
Lovely war.
Be a soldier, eh?
Oh, it's a shame to take the pain.
As soon as the valley has gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up till the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.